All right. We are back in the book of Second Samuel. We're picking up about midway through in chapter 10. So, 1st and 2nd Samuel go together, um, and then they'll eventually bleed into 1st and 2nd Kings, and they sort of come out of Joshua and Judges. So, um, in 1st Samuel, we see the people of Israel are having problems with the Philistines. They want a king. They get King Saul. That doesn't go particularly well. The Philistines aren't taken care of. And halfway through, Saul is rejected by God and David is anointed king. Now, he is probably a teenager at the time. And the rest of 1 Samuel, as you know, is taken up with Saul trying to pursue David to get rid of him and how they're both acting. And finally, at the end of 1 Samuel, Saul dies, and in 1 Samuel we pick up David becoming king. Probably not. Whoops. Whoa. What did I hit? Okay. Can you fly me back? Use the roller thing on there and get me back to. Keep going. I want to get back a little bit. One more. There we go. We're going to look at the chronology of. Okay, so here's the chronology of 1st and 2nd Samuel. So 1st Samuel covers 100 years, and in 2nd Samuel, it covers about 40 years, the reign of David. And so 1st Samuel, 2nd Samuel is all about the reign of David. The first half of the book is about how he consolidates power, how he becomes king over all of Israel. It's just Judah, then it's all of Israel, and then finally, and things are going really well, the country's expanding, and in chapter 9, where we ended with the story of Mephibosheth, he reaches out to find a descendant of Jonathan who he can show hesed to. He can show loving kindness to. Then we come into chapter 10. Now, chapter 10 is very much a transitional chapter. It looks forwards and backwards. It feels like it should fit more with chapter 9 than what follows it. But the story that begins in chapter 10 doesn't end until the end of chapter 12. We refer to chapters 10, 11, and 12 as the Ammonite war narrative. And in chapter 11, we have the story of David and Bathsheba, and then 2 Samuel just goes downhill from there. Most of you are aware enough of the stories of what is coming. So, but today we're going to talk about trust God's best. Now we're going to talk about a lot of other stuff, and we'll come back to this at the end. So we're heading into what is the messiest part of David's life. I don't think that's a big shock there. And I noticed that when we come to the text, there are a lot of questions we ask the text that it doesn't answer. Millennials and Gen Z have a lot of questions, especially about the treatment of women that take place here. And in some ways, we're asking the wrong questions. Those are not questions. That's not the direction the text is going in. When I worked at Home Depot nights, one guy had loaned me a DVD copy of Bruce Almighty. So I had watched it. Monday, I came back to work, and we're discussing it. And it was a Monday that they'd hired an additional crew to do stuff, and it ended out not quite working out the way they thought it would, but that's not surprising. So at our first break, we're discussing Bruce Almighty. And when we got done, one of the guys who was new, who didn't know me, came up to me, and his burning question was, so did you like the movie or not? He couldn't tell from the conversation. And I told him that wasn't the point. So we're going to run into that a lot in the following chapters, because there are questions that we want to know. Who knew what when? But that's not the point of the passage. And we'll probably dive into some of that. The text gives us some hints. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of questions that we would love to have answered that the text doesn't answer. And we're going to have to live with that. But we're in chapter 10 today. And here's a map of Israel. We are going to focus a large part today on this little section. And Jerusalem, Jericho, and Ammon, and the capital city of Ammon. So, in the course of time, the king of the Ammonites died, and his son Hanun succeeded him as king. And David thought, I will show kindness to Hanun, son of Nahash, just as his father showed kindness to me. Now, this is not the first time we've run into Nahash, the king of the Ammonites. We have to go way back a couple of years into 1 Samuel, the first half. Saul has been anointed king, but he's not moving very quickly at becoming king. And Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, goes to Jabesh Gilead and makes them an offer. We are going to attack your city. If you surrender and let us put out one of your eye, on every male, one of their eyes, we will not come in and destroy the city and kill everyone. So they look at their options and decide living with one eye is better than dying. But they say, give us 3 days that we might find someone to defend us. Well, they send word out. Saul gathers an army together and goes up and defeats Nahash, king of the Ammonites. Probably then what happens in the latter half of the book is Nahash, the enemy, and David have a common enemy, Saul. And so somehow, we don't know how, Nahash had showed kindness to David. David now wants to repay that kindness. Oh. This takes us also where it looks forwards and backwards. So David has wanted to show an Israelite in chapter 9, Hesed. And David said, is there still anyone left for the house of Saul that I may show kindness or Hesed for Jonathan's sake? So he showed kindness, Hesed, to Mephibosheth. Now we come to chapter 9, and David thought, I will show kindness, Hesed, to Hanun, son of Nahash, just as his father showed kindness to me. So we see David showing kindness to both an Israelite and a foreigner. We also know that going forward, David totally forgets about showing kindness when it comes to chapter 11. But that's for another day. But this is a very important thing for David. Because as God says, he is a man after my own heart. Now, he gets off track eventually. He gets buying too much into the press coverage of what he is and what he's doing. But here, he is wanting to show kindness. And here's kind of a bigger map. Jerusalem, the kingdom of Ammon, and we'll have a few other players. So David sent a delegation to express his sympathy to Hanun concerning his father. When David's men came to the land of the Ammonites, the Ammonite commanders said to Hanun, their lord, do you think David is honoring your father by sending envoys to you to express sympathy? Yeah. Hasn't David sent them to you only to explore the city and spy it out and overthrow it? So Hanun seized David's envoys, shaved off half of each man's beard, cut off the garments at their buttocks, and sent them away. I mean, he wanted to offend them. He wanted to emasculate them in a way. You're going to go back with, everything showing from the waist down and half a beard. And your beard was tied very much to being a man. You didn't, in Israel, you didn't even shave your beard necessarily. And here he's shaving the whole thing off. Half off. So when David was told about this, he sent messengers to meet the men, for they were greatly humiliated. The king said, "Stay at Jericho till your beards have grown, and then come back to Jerusalem. I don't want you guys coming in here showing how humiliated you have been, how Amnon has made us." And this just isn't an attack on the images we get. I use from Free Bible Images, so we're not using the Lego Bible today. So David hears about Nahash dying, sends the envoys, and they are treated very miserably. Now, I understand at this time, Israel is a rising power, and they're a neighbor. David is getting control over all of Israel. At this time, the Assyrian Empire, which has been big and will be big again, is having a lot of internal political problems. Like, they have trouble keeping a king alive. There's a lot of assassinations, multiple kings vying for power. This leaves a power vacuum in this area. And surprise, surprise, God had this. I'm sure that God had something behind this, because now Israel can rise up to be a regional power. And they say, these guys haven't come to honor your father and show you kindness. They've come to spy out the land. They've come to get into the city, find out where our tunnels are, find out about how well we're protected, so that Israel can come and attack us. So instead of just hurrying them out the door, he shaves off half their beards. He does everything he can to embarrass them. He is trying to create an international incident. They're insults. Basically he's saying, you guys are nothing, we're big, and it's basically a declaration of war. So I don't know if he knows what he's getting into, but they come back. So when the Ammonites realized that they had become obnoxious to David, and I'm sure Shaphan's back there going, really? They had to realize this after the fact. They hired 20,000 Armenian foot soldiers from Beth Rehob and Zobah, as well as the king of Maacah, with 1,000 men, and also 12,000 men from Tob. On hearing this, David sent Joab out with the entire army of fighting men. The Amorites came out and drew up in battle formation at the entrance of the city gate, and the Armenians of Zobab and Rehob and the men of Tob and Maacah were by themselves in the open country. So, here's a quick map. I boxed in red all those groups that they have reached out to, which, by the way, are also neighbors of Israel. Now, this sort of reminds you how things goes in the book of Judges. The Israelites get a couple of victories, Jericho, Ai, and suddenly all the northern kings decide, we're going to get together and wipe them out. And what happens? They get wiped out. So instead of having to take each one of these cities individually, they beat all the kings at once. So all these groups are getting together because they think, hey, the bigger the army, the more it's going to be. And one of the things, Joab took out a much smaller army than we'll see later on. So on the one side, he has the Armenian army, probably to his north, and Joab is outside the gates of the capital city of Ammon, and the Ammonites are parked outside the city gates. So they're kind of in between the two. That kind of creates a problem when there's one army on one side and one army on the other side. The last thing you really want to do is fight a two-front war. So Joab saw that there were battle lines in front of him and behind him. So he selected some of the best troops in Israel and deployed them against the Armenians. So he is going to take a select group of the best men to fight with him. He put the rest of the men under the command of Abishai, his brother, and deployed them against the Ammonites. So they're going to fight. They split up to fight a two-front war. Joab said, if the Armenians are too strong for me, then you are to come to my rescue. But if the Ammonites are too strong for you, then I will come to rescue you. Be strong and let us fight bravely for our people and the cities of our God. Yahweh, the Lord, will do what is good in his sight. Then Joab and the troops with him advanced to fight the Armenians, and they fled before him. When the Ammonites realized that the Armenians were fleeing, not the Arameans were fleeing, they fled before Abishai and went inside the city. So Joab returned from fighting the Ammonites and came to Jerusalem. So, Joab divides the army into two groups. One of them is going to take on the Armenians, and the other group is going to take on the Ammonites. And Joab has this little speech he gives. If you come to my rest, if I'm having problems, you'll come and help me out. We're going to be each other's reserve troops. Well, the text doesn't spend a whole lot of time in what happened in the battle. It goes very quickly to the Arameans fled, and then the Ammonites, seeing that the Arameans were fleeing, they ran back into their city and closed the gate so that it would take longer to get to them. And hence, Joab wins the battle. The Arameans all go back home and try to figure out what they're going to do. And the Ammonites run back into their city. So after the Arameans saw that they had been routed by Israel, they regrouped. King Hadadezer had Armenians brought from beyond the Euphrates River. He had more troops that he could bring in. They thought they had enough troops, but apparently that wasn't enough. So he's going north and getting more troops. They went to Helam with Shobach, the commander of Hadadezer's army, leading them. So when David was told this, he gathered all Israel, crossed the Jordan, and went to Helam. And the Arameans formed their battle lines to meet David and fought against him. And they fled before Israel. And David killed 700 of their charioteers and 40,000 of their foot soldiers. He also struck down Shobach, the commander of their army, and he died there. Shobach, not David. And when all the kings who were vassals of Hadadezer saw that they had been routed by Israel, they made peace with the Israelites and became subject to them. So the Arameans were afraid to help the Ammonites anymore. So one of the things we see going on is, and this plays in a little bit later in chapters 11 and 12, when David first hears, he sends Joab. He stays in Jerusalem. He's going to let Joab go out and find out what's going on, what do we need to do? Because he is the king. He's not just a general. And this was, and as we see, when it's time for a big battle, David shows up to claim the victory. or the loss, as the case may be, depending on whether you're Hadad-Ezer or whether you're David. And this was common because the kings had a lot more to do than be just stuck away from the capital city. You know, stuff happens when you're not at the capital city. You know, people try to take over. There's conspiracies against you. There's decisions you need to make because there's still a country to run. There's religious events that you are a key part of taking a part of. So you wait until the battle is ready to be won. The war is going to be won. Then you show up and, like here, you take the credit because you're the king and you're there. So the Arameans go and recollect their army, gather all the troops that remain from fleeing, spend some more time training. Let's toughen up the troops. Maybe they're going, some of these guys were too green, but let's go up and bring down the real army. So they come out, and David this time takes all of Israel. So they round up everybody who they bring to fight, and they meet in Helam. And of course, things go badly. I mean, the writer gives us very little detail about the battle. They come and fight, and they flee. Doesn't spend a lot of time about how long the battle lasted, any of the strategy that was used. Just they fought, and they fled. And David took big advantage of this. He was able to take out charioteers. He was able to take out foot soldiers, and they surrendered. They sought peace with Israel, and as part of the peace deal, they became subject to Israel. So David now has their kings or whoever he put in as the king over the area. You know, he'll still let them kind of have some say, but the big thing he wants is, you're paying tribute to me. There's taxes that you owe my country every year. So that's what's going on here. But we're also left with a loose end. And the Ammonites are that loose end. They are still behind the wall. And that's going to set up chapter 11. And what will occur there. But I want us to go back and look at particularly verse 12. Because for as little as the writer of the book tells us about the battles, I mean, it's like, battle starts, they flee. I mean, that's pretty short. He spends a lot of time on what Joab says. And Joab says, hey, if the Arameans are too strong for me, then you'll come to my rescue. If the Ammonites are too strong for you, I'll come and rescue you. But then he says something that we're not used to from Joab. Now, Joab does not talk a lot, but we think of Joab as the guy who's politically savvy. I mean, he is very willing to take out people. I mean, we kind of think of him as a rascal. He's David's heavy. He'll do things, and David goes, you really shouldn't have done that. He's always putting politics first. But, you know, he's out there eliminating the competition, whether it's David's, as we'll see with Absalom later, or it's Abner, after David has just struck a deal with Abner to get the northern tribes to come and join. he calls back. He has a personal vendetta, and hey, if you're hiring the leader of the commander in chief or the army, the top army general from the other side, how does that make my position? But here he shows faith. Because kind of what bothers us isn't that there's this theological note in this, but it's who it's coming from. Because we're not quite sure we're quite sure what we think of Joab. I mean, he's the guy you want. He is kind of the fall guy. And when we get into 1 Kings chapter 1 and 2, and Solomon becomes king, David's instructions to Solomon are, get rid of Joab. You want a different guy being the top general. He's been a problem for me, and he's going to be a problem for you, even if he is family. Now you go, okay, is this a nation or is this the mafia? But Joab here speaks truth. He first of all points out, be strong and fight bravely, which that has been a cry for a lot of speeches given before battles, even if you know you're going to get wiped out. But then he goes, for our people and for the cities of our God. And he says, Yahweh will do what is right in his sight. So Joab didn't have the absolute certainty of victory. He couldn't point to chapter and verse. He couldn't go into Deuteronomy where it says, every time Israel fights a battle, they will win. Those of you that have followed Joshua and Judges, 1 Samuel, know that that doesn't always happen. But Yahweh will always do what is good in his sight. Sometimes it's victories, sometimes it's not. But Joab is going to put it in God's hands. Because he also knows that God has made promises to Israel. And that God has raised up David. And that God will do what is good and right in his sight. So like Joab, what we doubt is when things aren't clear to us. We don't always have chapter and verse to make decisions. We can't point to Bible verses to make business decisions, personal decisions, buying a house decisions, buying a car decision. Although there are a couple of cars recorded in the Bible, the Model T. It says Elijah went to heaven on high with the chariot, and it must have been a Model T. It was the first thing that would go in high. Then, of course, the bad joke about the disciples went around in one accord. So, yeah. But those don't help us make decisions about buying cars or anything. Taking Joab's words into our dilemmas may make us more confident, but no more clear. We don't always know what God has for us. And sometimes the decisions are we have to wait. Because we would like to know decision answers way ahead of time. We don't want to wait. We'd like to have things laid clearly out before us. And when decisions come up, that they're obviously and easily clear, even if it's months before we have to make the decision. We made some decisions back in the spring, back in March, and there were other decisions we needed to make, and I would always say, well, that's an August decision. Well, guess what? August is now just around the corner. And now we have to make some decisions. But we have to be willing to wait on God. And we have to trust for God's best. That's not always easy. And sometimes we wonder, what is God up to? Sometimes we feel like we're stuck in a wilderness. Like the Israelites were for 40 years. Sometimes we make decisions and think, was this the right decision? And some of those decisions, become stories we tell and don't really make much difference. And other times, they're stories that we tell later that show us how God was working to get us where we are today. We have to be willing to trust God for what's best. And sometimes it's waiting. Sometimes it's not being certain about decisions to make and what direction to go. But we can always trust God that He will do what is best.